He was escorting a fallen soldier. The airline tried to stop him. Big mistake. Sergeant Michael Reynolds had seen his fair share of hardship. A decorated Army Ranger, he had served multiple tours overseas, witnessing the cost of war firsthand. But nothing had prepared him for this mission, the one he had promised to fulfill no matter what. He was escorting his fallen best friend, Corporal James Jimmy Carter, back home to Tennessee. Jimmy had been more than just a fellow soldier. He had been like a brother. They had trained together, fought together, and dreamed of their future after the military. But an ambush in Kandahar had stolen Jimmy's life, leaving Michael to carry the burden of bringing him home. Michael took this responsibility seriously. He knew that military escorts followed strict protocol, standing by the casket, ensuring respect was given at every stop, and never letting the fallen soldier travel alone. It was the last honor he could give his friend. As he arrived at the airport, dressed in his Class A uniform, he carried Jimmy's folded flag under his arm. The weight of it felt heavier than anything he had ever lifted. The airline had been informed in advance that he was escorting a fallen soldier, and he expected the process to go smoothly. But he was wrong. The airline's heartless obstacle at the check-in counter. A distracted airline employee glanced at his ticket and frowned. "Sir, your ticket has been changed. We had to move you to a later flight," she said nonchalantly. Michael's heart pounded. "That's not an option," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm the official escort for a fallen soldier. His casket is on this flight. I need to be there with him." She barely looked up from her screen. "I understand, sir, but there's nothing I can do. The flight was overbooked. We've moved you to another flight in 3 hours." Michael clenched his jaw. "That's unacceptable. I need to be on this flight. I have orders to stay with the casket at all times." The woman sighed. "Sir, I don't make the rules. If you want to get on this flight, you'll have to wait and see if a seat opens up." Michael took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the anger bubbling inside him was growing. He had faced enemy fire, endured the loss of friends, and now, here he was, being told by a disinterested airline clerk that he couldn't do his duty. "I need to speak to a supervisor," he said, his voice unwavering. The woman rolled her eyes but picked up the phone. A few minutes later, a manager appeared, looking just as dismissive. "Sergeant, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but as my employee explained, your flight is overbooked. We can get you on the next available one." Michael squared his shoulders, standing tall in his uniform. "Listen carefully. I am not asking. I am telling you. That casket is carrying a soldier who gave his life for this country. I will not leave him alone. If I have to, I'll sleep on the cargo hold, but I will be on that flight." The manager sighed. "I wish I could help, but there are paying customers who—" That was it. Michael pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "General Matthews," he said as soon as the line picked up. "I need a favor." The tide turns 5 minutes later. The airline manager's phone rang. His face went pale as he listened. His eyes darted to Michael, and suddenly, his whole demeanor changed. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Right away." He hung up, then swallowed hard before facing Michael. "Sergeant Reynolds, I sincerely apologize for the mix-up. You will be on this flight. Please, allow us to escort you to the gate immediately." Michael said nothing. He simply nodded and picked up his bag. As he walked through the airport, something incredible happened. Word had spread. Travelers, flight attendants, even TSA agents began to step aside and stand at attention. Some saluted. Others placed their hands over their hearts. By the time he reached the gate, the entire waiting area had gone silent. A flight attendant approached, her eyes glassy with emotion. "Sergeant, we've upgraded you to first class. Thank you for your service." Michael shook his head. "No, I need to be seated near the cargo hold." She nodded, understanding completely. As the plane took off, Michael sat in quiet reflection. He had faced battles before, but this fight for honor and respect, had been one of the hardest. When the plane landed in Tennessee, he was the first off. He walked solemnly beside the casket as it was unloaded. Jimmy's family was waiting, their faces etched with grief. Michael saluted as they approached, his own tears finally breaking free. The airline had tried to stop him, but respect, honor, and loyalty had won in the end. And as long as he lived, Michael Reynolds would make sure no fallen soldier was ever left behind. Sergeant Michael Reynolds had never let bureaucracy stand in the way of duty. But today, he faced an obstacle unlike anything he had encountered on the battlefield. He was escorting his fallen best friend, Corporal James "Jimmy" Carter, back home to Tennessee. It was a promise he had made to Jimmy's mother when they enlisted together. If anything happens, we bring each other home. Jimmy had made the ultimate sacrifice in Afghanistan, covering their unit during an ambush. His last words to Michael had been, "Get them home, brother." And now, Michael was making sure Jimmy got home, too. Escorting a fallen soldier was a solemn honor. It wasn't just about standing by their side. It was about ensuring their journey was met with the respect and dignity they deserved. But as Michael approached the airport counter, he had no idea he was about to enter a different kind of battle. "A cold reception, sir. Your ticket has been changed. You've been moved to a later flight." Michael furrowed his brow. "That's a mistake. I have orders to be on this flight." The casket of a fallen soldier is on board. The airline employee barely looked up from her screen. "I understand, sir, but this flight is overbooked. There's nothing I can do." Michael took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "You don't understand. This isn't a request. I have to be on that flight." Her expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, but the next available flight is in 3 hours." 3 hours? That was unacceptable. Jimmy's family would be waiting at the other end. They had already endured days of grief. He wouldn't let them wait any longer. Michael set his jaw. "I need to speak to a supervisor. Now." The woman sighed and called for a manager, who arrived moments later with an equally indifferent attitude. "Sergeant, I apologize for the mix-up, but there's nothing we can do. You'll have to take the later flight," the manager said. Michael clenched his fists. He had carried Jimmy through firefights, over mountains, and across deserts. He wasn't about to let this be the reason he failed him. "You listen to me," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "That soldier died for this country. The least you can do is let me make sure he gets home with dignity." The manager sighed, unfazed. "I understand, but policy is policy." Michael pulled out his phone. "General Matthews," he said as soon as the call connected. "I need a favor." The power of honor within 5 minutes. The airline manager's phone rang. His face paled. "Yes, sir." Yes. Of course. Absolutely, sir. Right away." He hung up, swallowed hard, and turned to Michael with a nervous smile. "Sergeant Reynolds, I sincerely apologize. We've made arrangements. You'll be on this flight. Right now." Michael didn't need to say anything. He simply grabbed his bag and walked toward security. But something unexpected happened. Word had spread. As Michael moved through the airport, travelers stopped talking. TSA agents stood at attention. Flight attendants whispered among themselves. A few passengers removed their hats. By the time he reached the gate, a quiet hush had fallen over the terminal. A flight attendant, her eyes filled with emotion, stepped forward. "Sergeant, we've upgraded you to first class. Thank you for your service." Michael shook his head. "I need to be seated near the cargo hold." She nodded. "Of course, sir." As he boarded, passengers moved aside, some placing their hands over their hearts. One elderly man, a Vietnam veteran by the look of his faded army cap, saluted him. Michael returned the salute. The journey home the flight was silent as they took off. Michael didn't speak. He just sat there, staring at the cabin wall, thinking about the journey he and Jimmy had started together so many years ago. Halfway through the flight, a flight attendant approached him quietly. "Sergeant, we wanted you to know." She hesitated, her voice breaking. "The pilot is a former Marine. He's going to make an announcement when we land." Michael nodded. "Thank you." As they descended into Tennessee, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I ask that you remain in your seats for a few moments after we land. Today, we are honored to be carrying home a fallen soldier. His escort, Sergeant Reynolds, is on board, ensuring that he is never alone. We ask that you give him the respect he deserves." A ripple of emotion spread through the plane. Some passengers gasped. Others quietly whispered prayers. When they landed, no one moved. Michael stood first and walked toward the cargo hold. As the doors opened, he was met with a sight that made his throat tighten. A hero's welcome on the tarmac. Jimmy's family stood waiting, their faces streaked with tears. An honor guard was lined up, ready to receive him. The American flag was perfectly folded in their hands. Beyond them, dozens, no, hundreds, of people had gathered. Veterans, first responders, families with small children, all holding flags, waiting to pay their respects. Michael took a deep breath and stepped forward. He walked alongside the casket as it was carefully unloaded. The world around him blurred, but he kept his posture straight, his steps steady. When they reached Jimmy's mother, Michael placed a trembling hand on the casket before saluting. She reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for bringing my boy home," she whispered. Michael's voice broke. "He brought us home first." At that moment, a single trumpet began to play taps. A final salute. A hero's farewell. The airline had tried to stop him, but duty, honor, and respect had prevailed. And Michael Reynolds had kept his promise. Jimmy was home. A hero's farewell. As the soft notes of taps echoed through the tarmac, Michael stood frozen, his hands still raised in salute. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he held firm. Jimmy had given everything. His last breath, his future, his dreams, for the men beside him. It was only right that his homecoming be met with the honor he had earned. Jimmy's mother clutched the folded flag close to her heart. Her hands trembled, but her eyes, though filled with sorrow, held gratitude. Michael could see it in the way she looked at him, as if she knew the depth of the promise he had made and kept. One by one, members of the honor guard stepped forward, laying white gloves gently upon the casket in silent tribute. The crowd remained still, their heads bowed. Some whispered prayers. Others wept quietly. The airline crew had come out as well. The same manager who had tried to push Michael onto a later flight now stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him, shame evident in his expression. He had witnessed something that policies and protocols couldn't explain, something greater than any corporate guideline. Michael turned to Jimmy's mother. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "he wasn't just my best friend. He was my brother. He saved us all that day. I just hope I did right by him." Tears streamed down her face as she reached for his hands. "You did, Michael. You brought him home. That's all I could ask for." Michael swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll always be here for you. For his family. You're not alone." She squeezed his hand tightly. "Neither are you." The final march. As the honor guard prepared to move the casket, the military chaplain stepped forward, offering final words of comfort. The funeral procession would begin soon, leading Jimmy to his final resting place. Michael walked beside the casket, just as he had when it was first placed on the plane. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he never faltered. He wouldn't now. Not for Jimmy. Not for the men they had lost. As they reached the waiting hearse, a deep silence hung in the air, until something remarkable happened. A single clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted into applause. Strangers, veterans, airline staff, police officers, firefighters, and fellow soldiers all stood together, honoring Jimmy with the kind of farewell only a true hero deserved. Michael closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling sharply. Then, he straightened his uniform one last time, squared his shoulders, and stepped back. The doors of the hearse closed. Jimmy was finally home. Legacy of a promise. Days later, after the funeral, Michael sat on the front porch of Jimmy's childhood home. His mother had insisted he stay for a while, and he couldn't refuse. In his hands, he held an old photograph, one taken before their first deployment. Jimmy stood beside him, grinning ear to ear, arms slung around Michael's shoulder. "We're gonna make it back, brother," Jimmy had said that day. "No matter what." Michael exhaled deeply, gripping the photo tighter. "You made it back, Jimmy. I made sure of it." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of laughter from the backyard, where Jimmy's nieces and nephews played. Michael looked up at the sky. Somewhere, somehow, he knew Jimmy was watching. And he swore to himself that as long as he lived, no fallen soldier under his watch would ever be left behind. Because some promises were meant to be kept, no matter what.